Today we're going to discuss some similarities and differences between secular humanism and secular Buddhism. Hi folks, I'm Doug Smith. I'm the study director at the Secular Buddhist Association, that's secularbuddhism.org. And today we're going to discuss some similarities and differences between secular humanism and secular Buddhism, which are related kinds of philosophical life stances, if you like. To begin with, let's start with secular humanism. To get an idea of their ideas, we're going to look at some of the thoughts coming out of the Council for Secular Humanism, which is an organization founded by a bunch of people, probably most importantly Paul Kurtz, the American philosopher who lived from 1925 until 2012. He died fairly recently. His interest was in bringing humanism into a more secular mindset, because humanism had been part of religion, a part of Western Christianity ever since the Renaissance, basically, where humanism was a kind of a reaction to biblically based Catholic religion that placed humans' relationship with God first. So humanism was a response to that, placing humans basically in the center of the ethical sphere of interest. So there are various aspects of secular humanism. First of these is that it's what they call a comprehensive life stance. Paul Kurtz coined the word eupraxiphy, sort of a difficult word out of Greek, basically to mean that it was a complete, an intent oriented around a complete life. It wasn't just supposed to be some narrow interest that one had, like a hobby or something, but it was supposed to be something that kind of manifested in one's entire life. It's individualistic. It should be thought of as that way, in the sense that humans control their own destiny. They're not being controlled by a god or a church. The ethics as well is individualistic. It does not depend on divine command. Instead, it depends on, at least according to the Council for Secular Humanism, a consequentialist ethics. That is to say, what one does that is ethical, that is good because it has good consequences. It's not good because of judgment of some outside being. And similarly, what one does that's wrong is wrong because of its bad consequences, judged by results rather than by particular kinds of commands. It's also should be seen as a naturalistic philosophy. It is a philosophy that either doesn't recognize the supernatural at all or doesn't care about it, because we simply don't know anything about the supernatural. In this sense, it's what they say, a cosmic outlook rooted in science. Much of the impetus behind secular humanism comes from the sciences, the notion that we have no scientific evidence for supernatural realms or supernatural beings, and so therefore we should not believe in them, or at least we should not assume that their existence or non-existence has any role to play in our lives, or in our ethics for that matter. Now, secular Buddhism, I think we can tell, it has many similarities to this, and I've argued in the past that I think secular Buddhism can be seen as a part of secular humanism, a sort of an aspect of secular humanism. It's also a kind of comprehensive life stance. It should at least ideally encompass the entire of your life, the way you look at the world. It's also individualistic in the sense that we aren't being controlled by any outside beings. Our destiny depends upon ourselves, not on supernatural beings or supernatural realms of any kind, at least so far as we know. We control our own lives. And also the ethics as well doesn't depend on commands of some kind of or supernatural being. Now, one of the questions we may have, well, there's several questions. I mean, the first one is, to what extent is secular Buddhism rooted in science in the same way secular humanism is? And I think that there's a similar argument to be made on both cases. Secular Buddhism as well, I think, takes a lot of its strength from the modern world in which science is so important. Indeed, Stephen Batchelor has really said as much. They have a sort of a similar kind of interest in the sciences, in the idea that knowledge is a sort of a social enterprise, depending upon the viewpoints of many, the attempts of many people with differing ideas to come at the truth from different angles, rather than a notion of truth as something revealed to a particular person at a particular time and which we can only take on faith. But is Buddhist or secular Buddhist ethics necessarily consequentialist? This is a question that I think we have to consider, because at least some major interpretations of Buddhist ethics take it to be a virtue ethics rather than a consequentialist ethics. That is, that the Buddha said that the real ethical aim was to perfect certain kinds of virtuous mental states within ourselves. Mental states such as compassion, such as sympathetic joy, such as boundless friendliness, such as wisdom, and so on, rather than an ethics of looking at particular kinds of actions and deciding whether those actions are good or bad. Either traditional or even secular Buddhism is not incompatible with consequentialism, but I think a virtue ethics is perhaps a little bit closer to the spirit of it. Now, virtue ethics is an idea coming from Aristotle in the Western tradition. In fact, it's just really as naturalistic as consequentialist ethics. It doesn't need any kind of supernatural beings to be understandable. So it may be that the Council for Secular Humanism was simply being a little bit narrow in the way they pitched ethics within their particular context. I think perhaps a broader picture of a naturalistic ethics would include virtue ethics. I mean, other differences. Perhaps the major difference, I think, between secular Buddhism and traditional secular humanism is that I think traditional secular humanism is more a credo. Although Paul Kurtz liked to say it's something that encompasses our entire lives, at its base it's a kind of a belief system that involves a view of the naturalism of nature, a rejection or at least suspension of belief in supernaturalism, a kind of boostering of the sciences, and so on. But there aren't really at least classically, practices involved with secular humanism. On the other hand, secular Buddhism takes many practices from traditional Buddhism. In particular, most famously, the practice of meditation, trying to aim for calm states of mind, trying to aim for equanimous states of mind, trying to understand the way that our minds work from the inside. And this is done in order to minimize greed, hatred, and ignorance, in particular ignorance of certain features of lived reality, in order to make us better people, ethically better people. That is a particular, I think, difference between secular Buddhism and secular humanism, and one in which I think secular Buddhism has a lot to offer. There's also issues of social justice, where secular humanism has been always very interested in ideas of social justice. Secularists within the West have almost, their impetus in many ways comes from issues of social justice. That is less apparent, I think, in the earliest strata of Buddhism as a religion, although in the Mahayana you see somewhat more of an interest in social justice. But this is a way in which I think secular humanism can influence secular Buddhism in a beneficial way, and has, I think, influenced both Buddhism as its practice in the West in many ways, as well as secular Buddhism. I think finally, another difference between secular humanism and secular Buddhism is that secular Buddhism puts particular emphasis on three key features of reality as being important to understand, to come to terms with in daily life. And those are that everything is always changing, that as a result, life provides no secure refuge. No matter how good an experience is, it will always end. That the search for an experience to end all experiences is a futile one. And also, third, that there is no permanent self, that we ourselves are always changing. And so that part of our problem in the world is in approaching the world from a position where implicitly assumes that we ourselves are permanent and have certain kinds of permanent interests, permanent likes and dislikes, rather than that all of this is in constant flux. And it's this, I think, this adoption of these three, or an attempt to understand these three kinds of aspects of experience, that marks secular Buddhism as slightly different from at least mainstream secular humanism. Now, there's nothing unscientific about these three aspects of reality. In particular, when we're talking about life on a macro scale, all of these are scientifically correct. The world is always changing. There isn't any kind of experience that is permanently going to be satisfying. And there isn't an essential self. that is to say, a permanent self that is always with us, sort of behind our eyes, looking out from inside, as it were. All of this is compatible with secular humanism, I believe, and as a result, I still do think secular Buddhism is a kind of secular humanism. That's not to say that this was necessarily going to be of interest to every secular Buddhist, or every person who's interested in secular Buddhism. Some may have more of a skepticism about science than perhaps I do. There is no human enterprise that is perfect, and no human enterprise that gives us a complete royal road to the truth. There certainly is room for disagreement, even within secular Buddhism. Nevertheless, there are so many similarities between secular humanism, as propounded by people like Paul Kurtz, and secular Buddhism, that I think they deserve a lot of discussion and contemplation. So again, I hope that was of interest to you. Please don't forget to leave any comments or questions that you have in the comment section down below. If there's any other topics you would like me to cover in future of these video lectures, I always am interested to hear and to think of new things to discuss. So thanks again, and catch you next time.